a Younger's price list from the 1800s. And the reason I wanted to show this is you can tell a lot about how a beer was made by what they charged for it. You know, based on the price, you know, you figure the higher priced beers have a higher gravity, higher aging times. So you've got stock ale, you've got the Edinburgh ale, which is the, you know, like the Burton ale type strong sweet beer. So you've got draft and you've got bottled beers from the 1800s. And then here's another ad. So Scotch ale, a pre-war strong beer. So, you know, what can you get from this ad? Well, you can get that it's a full-flavored, heavy in gravity, strong. You can't use the word strong in the United States in advertisement. Priced as Bass and Guinness. So, you know, if you know anything about how Bass and Guinness were brewed, you can kind of figure out what the strength of this beer is. So that's the kind of research that people are doing, you know, and they're going and they're looking at these things and making comparisons. Here's another price list. You've got, from Younger's, you've got October brewings and you've got March brewings. And Younger's did brew some India Pale Ale. They brewed export Pale Ale, Strong Ale, and Stock Ale. So you can see the prices for these really strong ales were a little bit higher. And they had the October beers and the March beers. So they were actually advertised as such, which I thought was really interesting. This is a recreation of a very strong porter that was brewed by J.W. Lees in the 1800s. It was called Manchester Star. It was about 17.5 degrees Plato. You know, so that's probably going to be about 8% alcohol. And Garrett Oliver went over and rebrewed this beer with Lees. I got to taste some of that when when Steve and I were in England last year. We did make a quick trip to J.W. Lees and talk to them, and they poured us not only some of the harvest ales from several different vintages, but some of this as well, and it was a great trip. And then here's a beer that Steve Wellington brewed at the Bass Museum just recently, and this was an Imperial Stout called P2 that was from Bass in the 1800s, so a recreation of that beer. And here's another one, Worthington's E, which was a Burton ale brewed in the 1800s at Worthington's Brewery, and Steve rebrewed that as well. And we got to try both of those beers during our visit. How am I doing on time here? Am I okay?
You've got about 10.
Okay, good. I'll finish this up in about 5 minutes. I guess I'm going to send this out, and so all this stuff will be on the website or somewhere available. So I'm not going to go too much into detail on these calculations. But you know, when you read the recipes, if you see a quarter of malt or quarters of malt, each quarter of malt is 336 pounds or 8 bushels. A bushel of malt is 42 pounds of malt. And a bushel is basically how much malt fits into a cubic foot. A barrel of water in England is 36 gallons. Just some constants here when you look at the recipes. 2 bushels of malt will yield 1 barrel of beer at about 1056. So you can kind of do some fancy math, and you know, if you know the gravity of the beer and you know how many bushels of malt, you can figure out how many barrels of beer they got, or vice versa. Hops are often added on a per quarter of malt basis, so if you can figure out how many barrels of beer were made from the quarter, and you got the pounds of malt, you can figure out how many pounds per barrel or ounces per gallon from that. Wort gravity sometimes is listed as specific gravity. A 1060 OG in the recipes is often listed as 60, and brewers in England still refer to it that way. Instead of 1060, they'd say 60. And so sometimes that leads to some confusion. Brewers' pounds is what a lot of brewers use as well, and that's a pound, the weight of 1 barrel of wort versus 1 barrel of water. So looking at the brewer's pound thing and taking that and bringing that back to specific gravity, there's some constants that are out there, and I got these from Ron Pattinson's blog and then some other sites. 85 brewers' pounds per quarter of malt is kind of a standard. That's at 1056. So and that equates to about 4 barrels of wort at 1056. So 2 bushels of malt gives you 1 barrel of beer at 1056, and then everything else is just somewhat proportional. And if you see something that's listed, like Amsink's recipes, for example, are all listed in brewers' pounds. So you're looking at this recipe for this old beer, and it doesn't tell you what the gravity of the beer is, but it gives you brewer's pounds. Well, you just divide the brewer's pounds by 0.36, and that'll give you the gravity of the beer. So here, 85, which is your constant here, divided by 0.36 gives you 1059, which is pretty close to 1056. So those constants are not exact, but they work well enough to give you at least an idea of what's happening. I got some examples here. I'm not going to go over those because I want to make sure that I get a chance to thank some people and then leave some time for questions. All of these folks have been very helpful to us as we've researched our IPA book and in helping us decipher things and supplying information. So I wanted to thank them, Martin Cornell and Ron Pattinson. Kristen English, who works with Ron Pattinson, I don't know if he's here today, but he sent me some recipes, and we've talked a bit about recipes, and he does a great job. Christopher Bowen, of course, we talked about him earlier. Group we're calling the IPA Hunters. When we went over to England to research IPA in Burton, Mark Dorber and Roger Putman, who used to be a brewer at Bass and now is a publisher of the International Brewers magazine, put together this group of brewers and historians together, and they met with us for 2 solid days, and we talked about old brewing techniques. And I'm very much indebted to them. So Mark Dorber, Roger Putman, Paul Bailey, who was a brewmaster at Marston's, Ray Anderson, who's the president of the Brewery History Society in England, Tom Dawson from Bass, Steve Wellington, of course, I've talked about him already, Steve Brooks from Marston's, and Des Gallagher from Marston's. Ray Daniels, of course, for supplying me with some of the Ansinks recipes, great stuff, and the NHC staff for having me here today, and Stone Brewing Company for letting me be here. So I wanted to say thanks to all those folks, and I thank you all for coming. And at this point, we'll open it up for questions.
So we understand yeast very well these days, but we can't always get these big beers to ferment out. How do they get these big beers to ferment out when they didn't understand yeast back in the day?
A very good question. The question was, how do they get these big beers to ferment out? Because they didn't have anywhere near the understanding of yeast that we do today, and we still struggle with it. A lot of these beers didn't ferment out. They were very sweet, and I think that's one thing to know. But the other thing is, if you look at the brewing procedures, a lot of times what the brewers would do is do a couple of day primary ferment in a tank, and then they drop the beer into a holding vessel, and they would re-oxygenate the beer by doing that. I don't think they realized what they were doing, but when you drop the beer out of a fermenter into a shallow, like a shallow open top fermenter, and then transfer it into barrels, you're re-oxygenating the wort, and then that helps spur the fermentation. And then, of course, they didn't have temperature control, and if it got really warm in the summer, that would allow, and barrels allow some oxygen ingress, and you get some fermentation going on there.
So what do we drink there?
This is the Stone 14th Anniversary Imperial IPA, and this was inspired by some of the Burton IPAs of the 1800s.
Which recipe is the 15th based on?
That is a new one, and I can't say anything more about it. You'll see in about a month. Any other questions? Yes?
In general, what was their understanding of yeast, or how did they deal with that?
My understanding is the brewers knew that tan mass at the bottom of their fermenter was important. They knew that they had to add it to the next fermenter. They didn't really understand that yeast was a living organism. They just thought it was this substance. And there were theories that were bouncing around that fermentation was a chemical reaction and not a biological process. But they knew if they didn't have this stuff collected off the foam, off the fermentation, and didn't add that to the next batch, it wouldn't ferment. So, they understood it from a practical standpoint. They just didn't really understand what was happening.
Yeah, with 1 to 2 years storage, did they do anything to protect from oxygen contamination, or just accept the damage?
I think the question was 1 to 2 years storage. Did they understand the ramifications of oxidation and do anything to protect it? I've heard a few things. In general, I'm going to say no, but I may be incorrect. I know that there were... I remember reading something about some brewers putting oil over the surface of their beer, like olive oil, to prevent oxidation. And that might have spurred, olive oil is one of those things that people think help yeast growth, and that might have helped spur a secondary fermentation in there, because olive oil has all the sterols you need for yeast growth. In general, I think the oxidation piece was somewhat an accepted part of the flavor development as the beer aged. Anything else? Or okay, yeah, one more.
Did they have some kind of technique for estimating the rest temperature or mass temperature?
They used their hand. Yeah, I mean, they didn't have thermometers until the 1700s, and then they started using thermometers. But until then, they just, you can read like a George Washington brewing recipe or something, and they talk about how warm the water needs to be and things like that based on, whether you can see your reflection or in the water, or whether it's steaming where you can't see your reflection, and that's kind of where they wanted it, for mashing in. It was all kind of intuitive. Yeah. Rule of thumb. So, all right.
Thanks, mate.
Okay. Well, thank you.